War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 47, the Roman Army. I often fear when I commit to a subject that I have bitten off more than I can chew, and I certainly have here. The Roman Empire arguably lasted nearly 2,000 years, if you count the Eastern Byzantine, as they certainly did. And considering the unquestionable influence Rome had upon later empires, it continues in spirit, if not in name, today. This is certainly true of its army. This will not be an account of those famous battles, both victories and defeats, that Rome engaged in. Rather, an overview of the army that fought those battles, and what were the aspects of Rome's military strategy and, perhaps more importantly, Rome's military culture that made its army the most famous in history. To start with, Rome copied what worked and abandoned what didn't. Prior to the rule of King Servius Tullius in 550 BC, there was no army per se. Rather, the bands of clansmen engaged in individual combat in and around their farms and settlements. But the great king introduced a compulsory levy that mandated service for all male citizens of the city. He copied the heavy infantry of the phalanx of the then dominant Greeks, as well as the use of rurari or later velites, who copied the Greek peltasts as light infantry. As with all podcasts that I do that involve any sort of foreign language, my apologies up front for all mangling of the correct pronunciation. This available manpower gave him approximately 9,000 troops, which was later divided into two groups known as legions. This 4,500 soldier legion would remain a constant for nearly a millennia. Despite this large-scale inspired formation, the majority of fighting during the era of the kings was small-scale skirmishing, with far smaller groups. And here the centuria is mentioned, and probably indicated the militia called up for service from a small community, with no set size, but roughly 100 men. It wasn't until the 1st century during the Marian reforms that the size was formally established. During the famous Punic and Pyrrhic Wars from 300 to 200 BC, and following the destruction of Carthage, the next 100 years of expanding the empire around Mare Nostrum, as the Mediterranean was called by Rome, literally RC, it was the maniple that became the basic level of tactical formation. The word translates to handful of soldiers. Polybius provides the best-known description. A legion during this period would be 10 maniples of 120 hasti each in the first line. The hastati were the junior-most legionnaires and provided the front rank of what was now a 3-line standard formation. Then 10 more maniples of 120 principes. These were the heart of the legion, experienced fighters, but strong, fit, and young enough to provide the best mix of youth and veteran status. Lastly, the third line was 10 ranks of half-strength maniples of 60 triarii. These were the most experienced troops, kept as a de facto reserve and available as needed for that last push for victory or to stave off defeat for an orderly withdrawal. Instead of a mass of troops, you had 30 separate tactical units set in 3 lines, giving both depth and flexibility. The maniple itself had 3 rows of 40 men each in the typical formation. Famously, these maniples would have relatively large gaps between them during the initial phases of battle, described rightly as a checkerboard. The light infantry would begin the fight, casting their javelins at the enemy to break them up and inflict some casualties, before retreating through the gaps of the front line hastati. After this, the front line would come together to a solid front presented to the enemy. The front line hastati and second line principes were equipped with identical large square shields, a short sword known as a gladius, itself a design stolen from the Spanish, a sheet metal breastplate, and 2 javelins called a pila. In the actual fight, the legion combined the unity and strength of the phalanx, but allowed individual combat prowess to shine in the manner of the Homeric legends. Peeking from behind their large shields, front-row legionnaires would thrust with their sword. This front-line combat being so exhausting, maybe after only 30 seconds the front line of the maniple would retreat through the gaps in the line to be replaced by a fresh infantryman. This process allowed a regular break in combat, allowing the formation as a whole to engage far longer than their enemy, eventually leading the enemy to break where the Romans accompanying cavalry and aforementioned light infantry would chase them down to slaughter the fleeing mob, as they had done for the previous 1,000 years and would continue to do so for the next 2,000. These relatively complex maneuvers of opening and closing ranks, replacing exhausted front row soldiers without breaking the solidarity of the overall formation, required constant drilling and practice. As the Roman Republic began to expand to the age of empire, the so-called manipular system would be changed again to reflect the requirements of a standing army instead of a universal militia. Much of this was driven by the social reforms as Roman citizenship was expanded in 100 BC to all Italian citizens. Previously, the legionaries were recruited solely by citizens of the city of Rome, and service was as much a political as military obligation and perquisite for those landowners fortunate enough to be eligible for service. The changes made during the late Republic and early Empire are collectively known as the Marian Reforms, named after consul and general Gaius Marius. However, while the reforms were relatively fast, they were not because of a singular act of a singular man, rather a response to expanded citizenry, expanding imperial boundaries, and the demand for an expansive army. The largest change by far was the development of a professional standing army. The relatively rich landowners who made up the manipular legions had no desire to stay under arms longer than necessary. But, following the social reforms, landless poor were now citizens, and they found soldiering a route to later success, as lands and booty were distributed to the legionnaires following victory. Previously, much of the barrier to entry was the requirement for the soldier to supply his own arms and armor, but now the state supplied them. This also led to the slow dissolvement of the light infantry forces, as the cost to raise and maintain a soldier was little affected by the cost of mass-produced arms. Heavy infantry in the form of the legionnaire was much preferred. Most notably, the length of service expected went from 10 years to 25 years, for essentially an all-volunteer force, though in times of emergency conscription could be used. This imperial Roman army would be the primary force from the time of Augustus to the fall of Rome. After the civil war, from which Augustus emerged triumphant following the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Roman armies were massive. There were 50 legions, each of approximately 5,000 troops. Augustus disbanded half of the veterans, spreading those who had fought against them in 28 new Roman colonies. These new legions, being full-time soldiers, served primarily far from Rome, as most at this point were Roman in name and not origin. This was not a surprise. Augustus forbade them from marrying. However, those stationed far on the border regions often developed marriage-like relationships. Just as large as the 25-strong legions was the auxilia forces, made up of the colonized forces. Less regimented, despite being organized into regiments, than the legions, they had infantry, mixed infantry cavalry, and pure cavalry forces. Later, these auxiliaries would be granted Roman citizenship upon completion of their 25 years of service. For the main legion, you had the standard contubernium, consisting of 8 legionnaires and 2 servants. They would share a tent, cook communally, and provided the smallest unit. 10 of these combined to form the famous century commanded by the centurion. Each century would have a standard bearer, which we would call today the guidon bearer, as well as a horn player, much like a bugler, to signal in combat. The centurion had an executive officer called the optio, and a first sergeant equivalent called a tesserarius, who handled garrison responsibilities, such as who should pull guard and when, or what we would call the CQ, or in charge of quarters. Centuries combined in what would be known as a cohort of 6 centuries, or 480 fighting men, what we today would recognize as a battalion, and then there were 10 cohorts in a legion. There are generally 10 combat battalions in a U.S. Army combat division now, coincidentally. While the Imperial Legion had a squadron of cavalry, these were used for scouting and messaging. The combat use of cavalry was reserved to the auxiliary. These units had both light and heavy cavalry. Additionally, the auxiliary had infantry similarly equipped and trained as the legions, albeit generally tasked with maintaining flank security in the combat. They had dedicated archers and engineers with siege equipment and the heavy artillery. And with the imperial era and the large standing army, you needed a robust means to maintain this army. And here is where the Roman era truly introduced modern logistics, even if they didn't coin the term. Armies, before and after, usually relied upon plundering the countryside they traveled through to maintain their armies. An army could not stay in one place long, for the simple reason they would denude all available food quite quickly. So while you could mass a relatively large army under such circumstances, this mass was short-lived before starving itself. The siege of Ilium, often called Troy, was by relatively small amounts of troops, maintained by a constant supply of ships from the various lands from which the Argives came. 90% of all supply demands fell under three categories: forage for horses, food for men, and firewood for heat and cooking. And while the Romans far preferred to pay to acquire these things locally, this was not always available. Ships, then and now, provided the baseline for resupply, and were used until no longer available, whether by river or sea. Then the quite famous Roman roads were used as oxen-pulled carts. Each legion required over 12 tons of grain daily. For comparison, the common freighter of the era could carry 200 tons, with but a dozen or so crew. This same capacity would require 300 wagons, itself requiring fodder for 1,200 oxen, and pay for the drivers, and moving far slower than even the primitive square-sailed freighters. Much of the reason the Roman Empire culminated at the Rhine River was for logistical demands, as any resistance put up by the Germanic tribes. For grain, Egypt was a key source, as the Nile Valley proved then and now as extremely fertile. On the march, the standards were impressive. Each legionnaire was expected to carry his basic combat kit, engineering tools such as a basket and pickaxe and rough spears. This roughly equated to about 60 pounds. Each night, after the standard 20-mile march, a very prescribed camp would be laid out on the most defensible terrain. Trenches would be dug around the entire camp. The spoil from the trench would make a rampart, and on top of the rampart a palisade of the sharpened stakes. Tents would always be located at the same location, with the same spacing. Depending on terrain and weather, it could take 2 to 4 hours for the roughly 5,000 men of the legion to construct their camp. In the history of the Roman army, no such camp was ever recorded as having fallen to a surprise enemy attack, and, indeed, after an infrequent defeat on the battlefield, the legions could and did retreat to these camps to maintain order and avoid the usual rout following such a loss. The actual tactics of warfare are, unfortunately, not particularly well known. The use of the light infantry and pilum javelins to disrupt the enemy are known. I suspect the tactics were quite flexible based upon the nature of the terrain and the enemy. The famous entrapment of Hannibal's war elephants being a good example, where they opened up large holes in the formation to allow the elephants to penetrate, and then surrounded and speared the poor beasts to death. They could dispense with the 3 ranks, create a wedge with the cohorts or maniples strengthening the center. Nay, they deliberately weakened the center to allow Hannibal to penetrate and ultimately be surrounded. By the Empire era, most fighting was counterinsurgency, where the legions did not even attempt to come to grasp with the rebellious directly, but rather mostly laid siege to their cities. Here, too, the Romans were impressive, relying upon the ancient artillery of catapults and large crew-served crossbows. Over 700 such devices were used in the siege of Jerusalem during the Jewish revolt. The Roman success over several hundred years, creating an empire that would last for over 1,000, and whose ramifications shaped the modern world, had several factors that give lessons today. First, the flexibility of Roman thinking at every level. Its weapons were a blend of stealing what was better and creating their own, such as their siege engines. When the Punic Wars demonstrated the weakness of the Roman navy, they basically copied the Punic design and created marines for fighting ship to ship. The discipline and mass of the legion matched the failings, but gave room and flexibility for the superior training of the individual legionnaire. At times, the Romans were devoid of meaningful cavalry, but adapted as circumstances dictated. In the static fortresses of the empire, a large contingent of idle cavalry was counterproductive, but against the Parthians, they were more than a match for their famous equestrian enemy. Second, the logistics allowing Roman encampments to exist for centuries and remain essentially Roman. The roads, depots, and forts shaped Europe into what it is today. Roman roads are still used, a few still in original form, famously in the Paris-Roubaix bike race, and untold thousands more whose original foundation provided the basis for modern asphalt. Third, and most decisively, the Romans were disciplined at every level. The conquering of Spain took 150 years. Their grand strategy of empire was steadfastly maintained from kings to the Roman Senate, the Republic, until the age of emperors. It was not Rome that fell. Rather, Romans were replaced by the Goths. When the Roman identity disappeared, so too did the Roman Empire. The loss of 3 legions in Teutoburg was not a cause for retreat from empire, but a time to prepare for revenge and prestige. It took 5 years to prepare for, but all the world knew that Rome would never ignore a setback. After Hannibal crushed the Romans for several years, Rome never wavered. It was only a matter of time until Carthago delenda est. At the individual level, the harsh discipline, long enlistments, and constant physical toil created an individual infantryman, while, perhaps not the strongest or largest, was, in every sense of the word, uniformly superior to any he might face. But when the Romans no longer served in the Roman army in defense of the Roman Empire, this uniting influence was lost. But it took a long time to do so. The Roman army was defeated when the Roman army no longer wished to hold to the standards which made it the envy of the world and a constant fascination for people even today. And yet, we can't say the Roman Empire was the most expansive of the pre-industrial era. That title goes to the Mongols, who conquered not only most of Europe, but nearly all of Asia, and did so in a manner almost completely opposite the Romans, and whose fascinating differences we will go over next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.